The first sound that tore through the stillness of the night was not birdsong, nor the whisper of dawn creeping over the horizon. It was the crack of a whip against the post outside the slave quarters. Kwame's eyes snapped open in the dark. The stench of sweat, blood, and damp wood filled his nostrils. Around him, the other men stirred reluctantly. Some groaning, some silent, all carrying the same exhaustion carved into their bones. The wooden planks of the barracks were warped and rotten, riddled with holes where the wind slid through like icy fingers. Rats skittered in the corners, gnawing at the crumbs that even hunger-starved men had overlooked. Up, up, you filthy animals! The overseer's voice bellowed outside. Another crack of the whip, followed by a shriek as someone too slow to rise was struck even before he crossed the doorway. Kwame pushed himself up, his muscles screaming in protest. Every limb felt like it was tied down with weights, every step toward the door a punishment. The heavy iron collar around his neck rubbed against raw skin, the open wounds never given time to heal. He glanced down at his hands, the calluses so thick they seemed like stone, yet still blistered from yesterday's labor as he stumbled toward the light spilling through the door. He caught sight of a Matha older woman who often whispered prayers at night. She leaned heavily against the wall, her breath ragged, her eyes glazed with fatigue. Still, she rose. They all rose. They had no choice. Outside, the chill of the morning slapped his skin. The air smelled of damp earth, sweat, and the faint smoke from the master's house. The overseer, a pale man with cruel eyes, paced before them, coiled whip in hand. He sneered as the line of slaves assembled, his gaze searching for weakness. His boots crushed the mud beneath him, yet it was Kwame who felt crushed under that gaze. "You dogs will break your backs today," the overseer spat. "And if any of you think to slack, you'll taste the whip until your bones show." Kwame lowered his head, as they all did. To meet the overseer's eyes was to invite pain. But even as he bowed, a flash of memory struck him. His mother's soft hands pressing food into his palm. His father's proud voice teaching him to till their own land. That land was gone now. His family was gone. The memory was a knife and a bomb all at once, reminding him of who he had been, but cutting deeper each time it faded. The chain connecting his wrists clinked as the line began to march toward the fields. The mud swallowed his bare feet, sucking at them with each reluctant step. The overseer shouted and cursed, lashing the air to hurry them along. When they reached the fields, the sun had just begun its cruel climb. Endless rows stretched before them, the earth heavy with stones and weeds. Kwame was shoved into place, handed a hoe so battered it was more splinter than wood. His stomach growled, but there was no food knot until sundown. If he survived that long, the day began with the rhythmic thud of hoes striking earth. The overseer's whistle of lashes slicing through the silence whenever someone faltered. Sweat stung Kwame's wounds, dripping into the lashes carved across his back. His vision blurred with fatigue, but he forced himself to keep moving. One pause, one hesitation, and the whip would come for him. By midday, the heat pressed down like a weight. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one harder than the last. He bent to pull a stubborn weed, and his knees buckled. Before he could right himself, the overseer was there. Lazy swine. The man roared, his whip singing through the air. The lash tore across Kwame's shoulders, fire exploding under his skin. He cried out, stumbling forward into the dirt. Laughter erupted behind him, not from the slaves, but from the overseers who had gathered to watch. Humiliation burned hotter than the pain itself. "Crawl then, if you can't stand." The overseer sneered. He raised his voice to the others. "Look at him. Look at what happens when weakness shows." Kwame pressed his palms into the mud, his breath ragged, his face streaked with tears and soil. The overseer kicked him in the ribs, sending him sprawling. For a heartbeat, Kwame wanted to stay there to let the dirt swallow him, to let the beating end his misery. But something stirred within him. A memory, faint but strong enough to spark. His sister's laughter high and free before she was sold away. His father's voice telling him that a man's worth was not in chains, but in the strength of his spirit. Kwame forced himself up on trembling arms. Dragging his body through the muck, each movement agony. The overseer jeered, satisfied at the display of submission. Yet in Kwame's heart, he whispered a vow. They could break his body, but not the last ember of himself that refused to die. When the sun finally began to sink, and the slaves were herded back to the quarters, Kwame's body felt like nothing more than blood and bruises wrapped in skin. He staggered, barely able to stand. But inside he clutched that ember like a secret flame as the night swallowed the sky. He lay on the hard floor among the others, his wounds burning, his stomach empty. Yet, when he closed his eyes, he saw his mother's face, her lips moving in a prayer. The overseer had forced him to crawl in the dirt, but in his dreams, he stood tall. That night, he whispered to himself, "Promise no one else could hear. They will not take my soul." Asterisk. Oh. The morning broke without mercy, before the sky had even traded its blackness for gray. The overseer's boots thundered against the wooden barracks. He slammed the door open, the whip dangling loose in his hand like a serpent ready to strike. The stench of fear filled the air as the slaves roused themselves. Rubbing at stiff limbs and half-healed wounds, Kwame rose slowly, his muscles screaming with each movement. The gashes from yesterday had crusted into ridges of blood across his back. Each time the iron collar shifted against his skin, it tore those wounds anew. Yet he forced himself to his feet. For to delay even a moment was to invite the lash dot. The overseer's eyes swept the line like a wolf searching for prey. His smirk widened when it landed on Kwame, as though he had already chosen his target for the day. "Move," he barked. "The master wants the fields turned before noon. If I see one of you crawling, you'll beg for death." The words were not threats. They were promises. The fields were soaked with dew when Kwame bent to his labor. His hoe struck the earth again and again, each movement dull and mechanical. His body screamed for rest, but his mind had learned the overseer's cruel language. The whip cracked not just on the back, but into the soul. Every stroke was a command. Obey. Submit. Do not dream. By mid-morning, the sun bore down, baking sweat into his torn skin. Kwame's arms shook with every swing. He tried to keep rhythm with the others, for unity in motion meant less chance of being singled out, but his exhaustion betrayed him. His grip faltered, the hoe striking at the wrong angle, jarring his wrists. The overseer was on him instantly. "You clumsy dog," he snarled. The whip uncoiled with a hiss, striking across Kwame's shoulders. The pain burst through him like fire, stealing the breath from his chest. He collapsed forward, hands clawing at the dirt. "Get up." The overseer roared. Another lash. Up. Kwame tried to rise, but his arms trembled too violently. The whip sang again, and he cried out, his voice breaking. The other slaves dared not look up. Their eyes stayed fixed on the earth, though their faces flinched with every blow. The overseer's voice twisted into mockery. "Listen, dogs. This is the language you understand. This is how I make you work." The whip came down again, splitting open old wounds, carving fresh rivers of blood into Kwame's back. His vision blurred with tears. The world spun. He felt his body sagging, ready to collapse fully into the dirt, and then stop. The word tore through the air like a crack of thunder. Amma had stepped forward. The frail, older woman, her frame bent with years of labor, thrust herself between Kwame and the overseer's whip. Her hands trembled, but her gaze was steady. The overseer laughed, a low, vicious sound. "You want his punishment, old hag?" Amma didn't speak. She simply bowed her head and spread her arms. The whip struck her instead. The sound was wet and sickening. She staggered but did not fall. Another lash came, then another. Her body twisted with each impact, but she held her ground. Protecting Kwame with her own flesh, Kwame's heart broke in his chest. He wanted to rise, to shield her, but his strength was gone. He could only watch in horror as Ama endured what should have been his torment. Finally, with a sneer of disgust, the overseer tossed the whip aside. "Let that be a lesson. You dogs will cover each other's sins and bleed for it." He stormed off, leaving silence in his wake, broken only by Emma's ragged breaths. She sank to her knees, blood streaking her back. Kwame crawled to her side, tears mixing with the dirt on his face. "Amma, why?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. She lifted her head weakly, her eyes glistening but fierce. "Because they can break your body, child," she rasped, "but they must never take your spirit. Remember that." Kwame held her words like a sacred truth. The whip had spoken its language of pain and fear, but Amma had answered with another sacrifice. Defiance, love. That night, back in the quarters, Kwame lay on the rough floor, every breath searing through broken ribs. He could still hear the crack of the whip in his skull, could still see Amma's frail body shielding him. But amid the agony, he clung to her words. The overseer's whip spoke of submission. Amma's axe spoke of survival. And for the first time, Kwame began to understand that resistance was not always in rebellion. It was also in the refusal to surrender one's humanity. The dawn crept slowly, but there was no gentleness in its light. It spilled over the fields like molten iron, pressing heat onto bodies already broken from the day before. The overseers barked their orders before the sun had even lifted fully, and the line of slaves trudged forward. Their chains rattling in the hush of early morning, Kwame walked among them, his back burning from fresh lashes, his mind heavy with the image of Amma's body shielding him from pain. She limped beside him now, her steps uneven, her breath shallow, but her gaze carried the same iron strength that no whip could extinguish. The fields stretched endlessly rows upon rows of soil, weeds and crops under the punishing sun. Here, time did not exist. Hours blurred together in sweat, hunger, and exhaustion. Silence was demanded, silence enforced. The overseers prowled like wolves, whips coiled in their hands, ready to strike at the faintest sound. Kwame bent to his labor, the hoe biting into the earth. The silence pressed on him, heavy as a shroud. He longed to speak, to share even a single word with Amma or the others, but he dared not. A single whisper could mean blood, yet beneath the silence lay stories untold. Every bowed head carried memories, losses, griefs that could not be voiced aloud. Kwame thought of his sister taken months ago in the night, sold to another plantation. He did not know if she was alive or dead. The thought twisted in his chest until it was almost unbearable. He wanted to scream her name, to beg the sky for mercy. But all he could do was dig into the soil, silence choking him tighter than the iron collar. The overseer's whip cracked in the distance, a cruel reminder that silence was survival. A man too weary to stand had been slow to lift his hoe. His punishment was swift and brutal. The slaves did not look up. Their eyes stayed glued to the ground, as though by ignoring the scene. They could protect themselves from sharing the same fate. Kwame's thoughts turned inward, silence amplifying the roar inside his mind. He remembered his father's voice, teaching him the language of the earth, the right way to dig, to plant, to nurture crops that belonged to their family, not to a master. Now that same earth swallowed his sweat and blood, feeding a harvest he would never taste. The betrayal of it gnawed at him. By midday, hunger had hollowed his stomach into a pit of fire. The scraps they were given each night were never enough to sustain them, and the overseers knew it. Starvation was their weapon, wielded as cruelly as the whip. The weaker the body, the easier to command. Kwame's hands trembled as he lifted the hoe again. His vision blurred. The field seemed to tilt beneath him. His knees buckled, but before he could fall, a quiet hand steadied him. She did not speak, only pressed her palm against his back for a brief moment before pulling away. Even in silence, her touch was a language of its own. You are not alone, that night. After the day's torment ended, the slaves dragged themselves back to the quarters. They collapsed onto the wooden floorboards, too tired even to remove the grime from their skin. But in the dark, when the overseer's footsteps faded, whispers rose like fragile smoke. Kwame lay with his eyes closed, listening. A man at the far end whispered a prayer for his son, sold away to a master in the south. A woman hummed a lullaby, her voice trembling but soft, the melody carrying the memory of home. Emma whispered words from her youth, fragments of stories passed down by her grandmother. Kwame felt his chest tighten. The silence of the fields had been suffocating, but here in the secrecy of night, silence broke. These whispers were dangerous, but they were also salvation. They reminded them all that they were still human, still connected, still capable of remembering what the whip demanded they forget. When Emma leaned close and murmured, "Do you remember the river?" Kwame's eyes burned with tears. He nodded faintly, though he dared not speak. He remembered the river near his village, where his sister once splashed and laughed, where his mother washed clothes under the sun. He remembered freedom. The overseers believed silence meant obedience. But here, among the broken and the weary, silence became defiance. Every whisper, every secret memory was a small rebellion, a refusal to surrender the truth of who they were. Kwame closed his eyes, clutching the memory of the river like a shield. The silence of the fields could not kill it. Not yet. The master's house loomed high on the hill, a pale shadow against the burning horizon. From the fields below, it seemed like another world, a place of comfort, power, and cruelty combined. It was from that house that Master Caldwell descended each day, his boots polished, his smile sharp as glass. Kwame had learned to fear that smile more than the crack of a whip. Caldwell was not content with overseeing labor or punishing mistakes. His cruelty was not merely physical, it was a hunger that thrived on humiliation. He delighted in breaking slaves not only in body but in spirit. That morning, the overseers dragged Kwame from the line of workers. His wrists were shackled, his body still trembling from the previous day's toil. He was forced up the hill, past the looming gates of the house, where the air smelled of roasted meat and fresh bread luxuries he would never taste. His stomach knotted, not only with hunger, but with dread, inside the courtyard. Caldwell lounged on a wooden chair, sipping from a silver cup. His pale hair glistened in the sunlight, and a ring sparkled on his hand. He smiled as Kwame was thrown to the dirt before him. "There he is," Caldwell drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "My stubborn mule. Strong back, but a slow mind. Tell me, boyar, you proud of that dirt you crawl in every day?" Kwame kept his eyes lowered, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. He knew better than to answer. Any word could be twisted into insolence, but Caldwell would not let silence shield him. "Speak," Caldwell barked, kicking a spray of dust into Kwame's face. "Do you think yourself a man? Look at you. You are nothing more than a beast I feed when I choose, beat when I please." Kwame's jaw clenched. He wanted to shout, to scream, to hurl the truth in Caldwell's face that he was a man, that his life had once been rich with love and freedom, but the memory of Emma's sacrifice, of Joseph's death, held his tongue still. Caldwell smirked. He leaned back in his chair and nodded to the overseer. "Make him sing." The order was as strange as it was cruel. A whip cracked across Kwame's back, and Caldwell's voice rang out again. "Sing for me, mule. Let me hear your song." Kwame's lips trembled. His throat was dry, his voice caught. Another lash tore into him, and the pain ripped a sound from his mouth, not a song but a cry. Caldwell clapped his hands together, laughter spilling from his lips. "Now that is music," he declared. "Sing louder, boy. Let your misery carry across the fields." The whip struck again and again, until Kwame's broken cries merged with the rhythm of the lashes. Caldwell leaned back, sipping his drink, as though he were listening to a performance crafted for his amusement. The overseers laughed along with him, their faces twisted with cruel delight. When Kwame collapsed into the dirt, Caldwell stood towering over him. He crouched low, close enough for Kwame to smell the wine on his breath. "You see, boy," Caldwell whispered, his voice venomous, "I do not need chains to own you. I own your pain. I own your shame. And every time you open your mouth, you remind me of it." Kwame's tears burned trails down his cheeks. Humiliation weighed heavier than the blows themselves. His cries had been turned into entertainment. His humanity mocked before men who saw him as nothing but a thing. When Caldwell finally waved the overseers away, Kwame was dragged back to the fields, his body trembling, his spirit battered. He staggered among the others, his face hollow, his silence deeper than ever. But inside him, a storm raged as he lifted the hoe once more, blood dripping down his back. He clung to the memory of his mother's voice, her lullabies, her songs of joy, her words that had once filled the nights with warmth. Caldwell could force him to cry, but he could not erase those songs. They lived inside him, hidden where no whip could reach. That night, lying in the dark of the slave quarters, Kwame pressed his fist against his chest. He whispered a vow, too faint for others to hear. "You will not take my soul." And though his voice was weak, though every bone in his body throbbed with pain, the words carried more strength than the master's laughter ever could. Caldwell's game was humiliation. Kwame's answer would be survival. Kwame's answer would be survival. The morning air carried no mercy, only dread. The slaves were herded into the fields as usual. But there was a heaviness in the overseers' movements, a cruel anticipation simmering beneath their voices. Whispers ran through the line like sparks in dry grass. Someone had defied an overseer in the night. Kwame's stomach clenched. Defiance was not tolerated. It was crushed, stamped out, buried beneath blood and silence by midday. The truth revealed itself. The overseers dragged Joseph into the center of the fields. His wrists were bound, his face swollen, one eye darkened with bruises. Joseph was not a young man, but strength still burned in his frame. He had always labored beside Kwame, steady and unyielding, never flinching at the whip's sting. Now, even in chains, his head was lifted high. The slaves were forced to stop their work and form a circle. Hoes dropped. Silence spread. The overseers stood around them with whips coiled, guns slung across their shoulders, grins twisted on their faces. Master Caldwell emerged last, his boots glinting with polish, his smile sharp and cold. He raised his hand for silence, though no one dared to speak. "This one," he said, pointing to Joseph, thought himself above obedience. He raised his hand against an overseer. He forgot his place. Kwame's chest tightened. He remembered the whispers of the night before, Joseph stepping between a young boy and the overseer's whip, refusing to let cruelty strike unchecked. For that act of protection, Joseph was condemned. Caldwell's voice cut through the air. "Let this be a lesson. Resistance brings only death." The overseers shoved Joseph to his knees. The whip cracked across his back, tearing cloth and flesh. Another lash followed, and another, until the soil beneath him was splattered red. Yet Joseph did not cry out. His teeth clenched, his head remained high, his silence louder than any scream. Kwame's heart pounded in his chest, his breath ragged. Each lash felt as though it tore into him as well. He wanted to shout, to beg them to stop, but the weight of fear pressed his throat shut. Around him, the others bowed their heads, some trembling, some silent, none daring to intervene. "Beg," Caldwell sneered, circling Joseph like a predator. "Beg, and perhaps I will grant you mercy." Joseph lifted his bloodied face. His voice, hoarse but steady, rang out, "You will never own my soul." The words hung in the air like thunder. Caldwell's smile vanished. His hand flicked. The overseer raised his gun. The shot echoed across the fields. Joseph's body crumpled into the dirt, lifeless. His blood seeping into the soil he had been forced to till. Silence swallowed everything. The only sound was the wind rushing through the rows of crops. Carrying away the last breath of a man who refused to bow, the slaves were ordered back to work, as though nothing had happened. As though a life had not just been extinguished before their eyes. Kwame's hands trembled as he lifted his hoe again. His vision blurred with tears, but he did not let them fall. Joseph's words thundered in his chest. Louder than the overseer's whip, "You will never own my soul." That night, back in the quarters, grief suffocated the air. No one spoke at first. The silence was too heavy, too dangerous. But when the overseer's footsteps faded, AMA whispered Joseph's name. Others followed, repeating it softly, reverently, like a prayer. Kwame sat in the dark, his fists clenched. Joseph was gone, but his defiance remained. His refusal to beg, his final words were not weakness, they were strength. Strength that Kwame now carried like fire in his chest. He lay on the floor, staring into the shadows above, and swore to himself, "I will not break. Even if I die, I will not break." The overseers had killed Joseph's body, but his spirit lived on in every whisper that night. In every memory carried by those who had witnessed his last stand, Kwame knew the cost of resistance, but he also knew its power. Joseph had taught him that dignity, even in death, was a form of victory. Asterisk night fell heavy, the air thick with grief. The fields lay silent, but inside the slave quarters, hearts beat with sorrow and rage. Joseph's execution still echoed in every mind. His blood had soaked into the soil they worked, and his final words lingered like a ghost. "You will never own my soul." The quarters were packed tight, bodies pressed against one another on the rotting floor. The smell of sweat, blood, and damp wood was suffocating, but worse was the weight of despair. Kwame lay on his side, staring into the dark, his body a patchwork of wounds. His mind replayed the gunshot again and again. Beside him, Ama's breathing rattled softly, each inhaled painful from the lashes she had taken for him. She shifted and her hand found his. Her palm was rough, scarred but warm. She squeezed once, a silent reminder, "You are not alone." From the far corner came a soft, hesitant whisper, a boy's voice, breaking under the strain of fear. Will they kill us all?" It was Tay, no more than 13, his thin frame barely able to carry the weight of a hoe each day. He had clung to Kwame since his own parents had been sold away. His eyes were wide in the darkness, searching for answers that no one dared to give. Silence followed his question. Speaking was dangerous even in the dead of night. The overseer sometimes crept close, listening for forbidden words. But the silence was unbearable. Kwame swallowed, his throat dry. "They may kill our bodies," he whispered back, "but they cannot kill who we are inside." Tay's breathing hitched. "But Joseph is gone," Kwame said, his voice steady though his chest ached. "But Joseph's spirit is still here. You heard him. You saw him. They could not take his soul. They cannot take ours either." Ama stirred, her voice low and raspy, but firm. "The body bends. The spirit endures." The words settled into the darkness like a bomb. Slowly, other voices began to rise, cautious, like sparks flickering against the wind. A woman hummed a lullaby, so faint it was almost more memory than song. A man murmured a prayer in a tongue that reminded him of his home. Ama whispered a story her grandmother once told her, about a river that carried away sorrow and returned laughter. Tay pressed closer to Kwame, his eyes closing as he listened. For the first time in days, the boy's trembling eased. Kwame felt his own heart steady. These whispers, these fragile sounds in the dark, were dangerous acts of rebellion. They were also salvation. The overseers could whip them into silence by day, but at night, in stolen moments, they remembered themselves. They remembered love, family, hope. They remembered freedom, even if only in words. Kwame closed his eyes and allowed himself to whisper. Almost to himself, "I remember the river." Ama squeezed his hand again. "Yes," she whispered back. "The river always remembers." For a fleeting moment, the darkness no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a shelter, a place where voices could rise softly and bind them together. The overseers believed fear could erase humanity. But in that night, in the whispers shared across the broken bodies of slaves, Kwame felt something powerful stirring. Not freedom, not yet, but the memory of it, and as long as they remembered, they had not been defeated. They had not been defeated. The days after Joseph's death blurred into one another, each hour dragged across Kwame's skin like a blade. The overseers had grown harsher, their whips snapping more often, their boots heavier on the backs of the weak. It was as if Joseph's final words had enraged Master Caldwell. And now the master sought to extinguish every spark of defiance with blood, and Kwame had caught Caldwell's eye. The master seemed to delight in selecting him for punishment. finding excuses to tear flesh from his back. Too slow in the field, too weary at the mill, too quiet when spoken to, every small slip brought the lash. Kwame bore it in silence, his jaw clenched. But his silence only fueled Caldwell's cruelty. One morning, Kwame stumbled beneath the weight of a sack of grain. His knees buckled, the sack spilling into the dirt. The crack of Caldwell's cane came instantly, striking across his ribs. "Stand up!" Caldwell barked, his voice dripping with venom. Kwa tried. His muscles screamed, his breath ragged. Another blow came, harder, dropping him to the ground again. Caldwell crouched low beside him, his voice cold and intimate. "You will beg, boy. You will learn what you are." The cane rose again, but this time Kwame caught the master's gaze. For a heartbeat, he forgot his pain. He saw only Joseph's face, bloodied but unbroken, whispering across time, "You will never own my soul." Something hardened inside Kwame. His lips parted, but no words of submission came. Only silence, heavy and defiant. Caldwell's eyes darkened. Rage twisted his features. He ordered the overseers to drag Kwame to the whipping post. The slaves were forced to gather, their tools ripped from their hands. Kwame's shirt was torn away, his arms bound above him. The whip cracked through the air, slicing flesh. Once, twice, 10 times. Blood ran down his back, soaking into the earth. The overseers grinned. Caldwell watched with cold satisfaction. Ama's face in the crowd was streaked with tears. Tay covered his eyes, trembling. "Beg." Caldwell demanded after the 30th lash. Kwame's body convulsed, pain searing every nerve, but still he refused. He forced his head up, his breath shallow but steady. "I will not break." The crowd gasped. Caldwell's face twisted in fury. The lash struck again, harder, faster. Kwame's vision blurred. The world tilted, his body threatening to collapse. By the 50th lash, he could no longer feel his legs. By the 60th, the world was only red and black. But through the haze of pain, he clung to Joseph's words, to Ama's hand in the dark, to Tay's fragile hope. He clung to the whispers of the night that reminded him he was more than chains. Caldwell stepped forward, sweat glistening on his brow. "You will beg, or you will die here." Kwame's lips moved. For a moment, it seemed he might surrender. The crowd held its breath. Then, in a broken whisper, he forced the words out. "You do not own me." A roar of rage escaped Caldwell. He struck Kwame himself, blow after blow, until Kwame's body hung limp from the post. The master finally stepped back, chest heaving, and spat at his feet. "Let him rot," he ordered. The overseers cut Kwame down and left him sprawled in the dirt, bloodied, broken, but alive. Barely, the slaves were herded back to work. But Ama and Tay lingered, rushing to Kwame's side when the guard's eyes turned away. Ama pressed her hands to his wounds, whispering through tears, "Hold on. Please hold on." Kwame's eyes fluttered open. He could barely breathe, every inhale sharp with agony. But a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I will not break," he rasped. Ama wept harder, clutching his hand. Tay knelt beside him, whispering Joseph's name like a prayer. Kwame hovered on the edge of darkness, his body shattered. But inside, a fire still burned. They had tried to destroy him, but his soul remained untouched. And that, he realized, was his greatest rebellion. Kwame never fully recovered from the whipping. His body bore wounds too deep, his flesh torn beyond healing. Every step in the fields was agony, every breath a battle. But he endured, day after day, clinging to life with a will that defied the master's cruelty. The other slaves watched him with quiet awe. He had not begged. He had not surrendered. In his broken body, they saw strength. In his silence, they heard resistance. Kwame had become something more than a man. He had become a reminder. Master Caldwell saw it too, and it enraged him. No matter how many times he lashed Kwame, no matter how many hours of labor he forced upon him, the slave refused to break. His defiance was silent but unshakable, a shadow that haunted the master's pride. One evening, after a long day in the fields, Caldwell summoned Kwame. The slaves were ordered to gather, their weary bodies forming a circle once again. Caldwell's boots struck the ground like hammers as he paced before them. "This one," he said, pointing at Kwame, "has poisoned you with his stubbornness. He thinks himself more than what he is. Tonight I will show you the truth." The overseer seized Kwame, dragging him forward. His body sagged, but his eyes lifted, meeting Caldwell's with a calm that unsettled even the guards. Ama cried out, but an overseer struck her to silence. Tay clung to her, trembling, his wide eyes fixed on Kwame. Caldwell raised his pistol, pressing the cold steel against Kwame's temple. The crowd fell silent, every breath caught. "Beg for your life," Caldwell demanded. His voice was a snarl, but beneath it there was desperation. He wanted, needed, to see Kwame yield. Kwame's lips parted. His breath was shallow, but steady. His eyes moved over the Crotome's tear-streaked face, Tay's trembling hands, the broken bodies that had labored beside him, the people who had shared whispers in the night, and then he spoke. His voice ragged but strong. "You may chain my body, but my soul is free." The words rippled through the silence, a fire spreading in every heart. Even in the face of death, Kwame refused to bow. Caldwell's rage boiled over. His finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot cracked the night open. Kwame's body fell to the earth, motionless, his blood darkening the soil. A moss scream tore through the air. Tay collapsed against her, sobbing. The slaves lowered their heads, not in defeat, but in mourning and remembrance. Caldwell smirked, thinking he had won. But he had not seen the fire in the eyes around him, the quiet rebellion his cruelty had sown. He had silenced Kwame's body, but not his spirit. That night, in the quarters, no one spoke of fear. They spoke of Kwame, his name, his words, his final defiance. Ama whispered, her voice breaking, "They can kill the body, but not the soul." And the others repeated it over and over, until the phrase filled the darkness like a hymn. Taib lay with his eyes wide open, clutching the memory of Kwame's final stand. He was only a boy, but he knew one day he would carry those words beyond the chains, beyond the fields, beyond the reach of men like Caldwell. Kwame's body was gone, but his soul had been unchained, and it lived on in every heart that had heard his final words.